Now we'll start the briefing operational information state security in Ukraine and SMM of OSCE, Alexander Hack, Deputy Head of OSCE in Ukraine. Please, the floor is yours. The briefing will be in English, so that's why if you need translation, you get the headsets at the back of the hall.
Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this brief statement by the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. I'm especially pleased to see some young people and individuals in the audience. I hope you learn from this briefing, and if you don't understand, please feel free to ask me questions right in the aftermath. This morning, ladies and gentlemen, I just returned from a almost 14 days uninterrupted stay in southeastern Ukraine. I have been there visiting my team in Mariupol and spent significant amount of time in the Ukrainian village of Shirokine, which is approximately 10 kilometers to the east of the city borders of Mariupol. Yesterday, just before I returned back to Kiev, I took part in a video link and a meeting of the Trilateral Contact Group where a disengagement plan for Shirokine has been discussed with all sides. I was joining this meeting in Solidar together with the Ukrainian general and the Russian general of the Joint Center for Control and Coordination at their headquarters in Solidar, from where I returned this morning to my headquarters here in Kiev. The purpose for the engagement of the mission in Shirokine and the surrounding area has its aim to encourage the parties to disengage from, for instance, the village of Shirokine, as well as to test our access to this town. Let me first talk about disengagement first. Following an initiative by the mission on 9th of April, the generals that I've met yesterday were asked to devise a plan for disengagement in Shirokine. The sides agreed in principle, and of the most important part of this plan, which is to demilitarize the village of Shirokine. The Ukrainian armed forces on the ground, the so-called DPR on the ground, as well as the two generals understood the importance to replace the military logic that is currently in that village with a civilian logic. I have stayed throughout these 2 weeks with my team in Mariupol. I'm aware that some citizens of Mariupol are concerned about this plan by the sides, and I met with those that are concerned to listen to their point of views. This I take very seriously, and I understand their fear. I have been with my team in Shirokine, and I have been under fire and under shelling. And last Sunday, when I was out in the town of Mariupol, I heard the distant shelling in Mariupol itself. You could hear the earth vibrating, and you could hear the outgoing and incoming artillery shells in the distance. We went to see the impacts of this shelling on Monday, and I can attest you here that we found the evidence that both sides have used weapons that shouldn't be there in accordance with the Minsk arrangements. Now, also Western diplomats who have visited Mariupol recently have voiced also their concern of the close proximity of the shelling to this very strategic seaside hub. I have also been to the trenches of the Ukrainian armed forces on the hills overlooking the village of Shirokine. And I've spoken to the commanders both of the regular armed forces, but also those of the volunteer battalions working and holding that line successfully since a long time. I also understand their concerns about demilitarization. But let me explain you further more here of what this plan is all about. Most importantly, this plan is not a plan that is owned by the OSCE mission. This is a plan that both sides, the Ukraine armed forces and the so-called DPR, are devising. It is their ownership and they have to agree on this plan. The mission is there to accompany them and to advise where necessary. The plan means that military formations and equipment should be moved back to a point where they cannot easily engage. When in Shirokine, you can see that the sites are very close to each other, at point closer than 50 meters from each other. They can look in each other's eyes on that very front line to the south of that village. The conflicts normally erupt in that town by a single exchange of small arms fire, then it's joined by mortar fire, smaller caliber, and then complemented by heavy artillery in the rear of the respective battlefields. The only reason why it erupts every day on a regular basis is because the forces are too close to each other. That is why a disengagement in that area is the only way to achieve stability so close to this important city. Now, this engagement will help to reduce the risk of new outbreaks of fire and escalation, and will also allow to any subsequent action, including the demining and eventually the return of what used to be 1,200 civilians living in that village. And very importantly, this plan has nothing to do with giving up territory, and no side will have to lose territory. This is about moving away from the village to a distance where the two forces cannot engage easily. Of course, this should come on top of what the Minsk arrangements already foresee. The Minsk arrangements say that all the heavy weapons should be withdrawn to a certain distance, and that should of course happen in addition to this idea of disengaging in Shirokine. But once again, this is not about control of Shirokine, this is not about losing Shirokine, this is about bringing about stability so close to Mariupol. It is now up to the sides to work out the details of this plan. As I have told you, the sides agree in principle that only disengagement will bring about stability. How they will achieve that is up to them now. It is now the 30th of April. We proposed the idea on the 9th of April. A lot of time has passed, and it's time now that this plan not only gains the favor of the commanders on the ground, but it is also endorsed at the highest political level. And of course, once it is endorsed, it requires implementation. The mission stands ready to observe that implementation and to accompany that very important process. When I have been with my team in Shirokine, we have also visited frequently those approximately 40 individuals that are still left in that village. These Ukrainian citizens don't want to leave their village because either they fear to do so, they do not want to leave behind their property, or they simply want to stay in the village in which they have been born. The village is without electricity, without water, and is littered with unexploded ordnances. There is not a meter in the town where you can't see a shell that has not been exploded. During our time in Shirokine, we are also to work with the sites to hold the fire and in and around mid of this month, we had a ceasefire that lasted for almost up to 70 hours in the area. It allowed these residents that we visited frequently to emerge from their basements, to breathe the air of their village, and to enjoy the sunlight out of their homes. We hope that these localized arrangements, such as the one we work with the sites in Shirokine, can be replicated elsewhere. But for this to happen, all sides need to demonstrate the political will and commitment, first in finalizing the plan, then endorsing it, and finally in implementing it, and respecting the ceasefire everywhere else. Let me also, what I have said in the beginning, say a few words about our access to these areas. Over the weekend and in the last days, the mission was repeatedly prevented by the so-called DPR from freely accessing the eastern part of that village. In fact, over a recent 4 days period, we were again and again prevented from accessing the villages at least 3 times. I've made it very clear to the commander in the village when he offered me that only 2 of us can go through, that I'm not negotiating access to the village, and that restricting our access is not just restricting our access, but it's an interference of our mandate, which was given to this mission by 57 participating states, including Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Also, and more worryingly, the so-called DPR has also used our presence to rotate their forces in and out of that Ukrainian village, using us as a protective guarantor to enable them to rotate their armed members in and out. I've made it very clear publicly as well that this is unacceptable, and we have told the sides that this will not be tolerated, and resulted in the fact that it didn't occur that frequently afterwards. I would also like to report to you that in the beginning of this week, on 27 and 28 of April, the team and myself visited several visits to the northeast of Shirokine. We went up to the town of Hranitne, where we have accessed that town for the first time out of so-called DPR-controlled territory. These were villages where this mission has never been before, and we have spoken to Ukrainian citizens in these places for the first time. In one of these villages, Staro Marivka, residents told us that of the original 370 inhabitants of their village, only 80 have been still living in the areas. This is that village that is just on the other side of the Kalmius River before you enter the town of Hranitne. Again, a village trapped in between the 2 sides. In the village itself, we have found craters that originate from the east and craters that have their origins in the west. In eastern Ukraine, these civilians have suffered long enough, and they desperately need normalization to occur. Those who had to leave for safer ground should be able to return now and rebuild their lives and their houses. The damage to civilian infrastructure is widespread, with the United Nations now estimating the cost of recovery, reconstruction, and peace building of $1.5 billion. With regard to recent public statements and allegations that our reports are not accurate, I would like to just say here that we report what we observe. We report what we see, and we report what we hear. This has and will remain one of the core pillars and one of the core guiding principles of this mission, which is to provide objective and verified information. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission has no other agenda than the mandate it has been given by 57 participating states to the OSCE. For more than a year, the mission has been reporting on an almost daily basis on the situation on the ground throughout Ukraine. Based on our direct observations in 10 cities and additional hubs, we have been able to document the situation that is evolving in this country. We are the largest international presence on the ground with around 450 international monitors and an overall strength of over 700 staff in total, 2/3 of which are deployed in eastern Ukraine. More than half of our monitors have military experience. These are professionals with reliable and trained eyes and ears. On this matter, I would like to make 3 points very clear. The SMM's reporting is based on direct observations. Our findings and observations are routinely verified. If we use other sources, we clearly indicate in our reports that we do so. The SMM maintains an everyday presence in and around Shirokine in particular, including at stationary observation points in the close vicinity of that village, which enables us to monitor and register ceasefire violations directly. The OSCE also operates under the principle of neutrality and impartiality and reports objectively about events that are occurring on the ground. The OSCE stands by its findings. It makes it also clear that if it would make an error, it would clarify this immediately. In closing, I would like to reiterate that all sides need to provide the mission unfettered and safe access to the entire conflict zone. Let me also reiterate that all sides need to exercise maximum restraint and fully assume their responsibility to prevent further displacement and suffering, and to redouble their efforts to reach out for a political settlement. The mission is here to monitor, report, facilitate dialogue, and support normalization. The parties themselves have to resolve their differences and live up to their commitments and agreements. First of all, stop firing. The mission can't do this for them. Thank you for your attention, and I'm now available to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hook. We have time just for a few questions, please.
Nick Shishko with the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for briefing us on the situation, and I really also want to commend your efforts in the escalation around Shirokine and elsewhere. Can you tell us more about the yesterday's video conference of the trilateral group? So you said sides agreed in principle on the demilitarization issues of Shirokine. What the other points were discussed, and did you see or feel that the talks were fruitful? I've heard yesterday that it lasted for almost 6 hours. So was it fruitful at all? And the second question is, what about these stationary observation points? You said you established one around Shirokine, and I think Ukrainian officials also wanted you to do something like that around Avdiivka and Pisky, closer to the airport. So do you have any plans of establishing those, and what are the main obstacles for you in doing that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. You will appreciate that I'm not able to talk on behalf of the Trilateral Contact Group. They will speak for themselves. I can just express my sense that if parties still talk to each other, and to an extent as it happened yesterday, this is a good sign. and this should continue and should continue frequently. With regard to these observation points, indeed we have in and around Shirokine areas where we can position ourselves and to observe what is happening in Shirokine from a distance. We can also do that in and around the airport of Donetsk, where we have found locations to a safe distance where we can observe what is happening in these hotspots. At the moment, our patrols patrol the area of eastern Ukraine during daylight only. That starts at 5 o'clock in the morning and ends over 2 shifts, now at around 7:30, 7:45, depending when the sun goes down. We have, on the night between the 17th and 18th of April, conducted a static overnight patrol in Shirokine itself, in the center of the village. This is one of the 10 hotspots where the President of Ukraine and others would like to see an increased presence of this mission. We have shown our willingness and our ability to do that when it is required. However, we need the sites to issue us access guarantees to these areas and guarantees of security. If we don't have this, it will be very difficult for an unarmed civilian observer mission to maintain permanent presences in these areas. But I would not exclude, if the parties would disengage, that we would establish a more permanent presence in one or the other of these locations. I reiterate again, the mission has now shown its ability and its willingness to do this. It is now up to the sites to implement what they have been committing to in September and in February in Minsk, that is to hold firing, to disengage, and to withdraw. We are willing to accompany this process, but it's up to the sites to enable us to do so. And what needs to happen first, and I reiterate again, is that the sites, most and foremost, need to stop firing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hook. Unfortunately, we have to stop here because due to the lack of time, the next briefing starts in just 2 minutes, but if you're willing to, you can continue conversation later on. Колеги, маємо завершувати брифінг за браком часу. Наш наступний брифінг за 5 хвилин. Дякую.